You're listening to Resilience Radio. This is Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive, as everyone has their own healthcare needs, and one set of advice doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. I'm excited to have today on the show Dr. Peter Bingham. He's a pediatric neurologist and division chief at the University of Vermont Medical Center. He's also a professor at Lerner College of Medicine. His focus is on optimizing the health and neurodevelopment outcomes of children and adolescents. He helps patients acquire the skills and habits that promote self-management, and we have so few pediatric neurologists in the state of Vermont. It's a real honor to have you on. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I would just make one other little addition, thanks, if I may. I'm speaking from my own professional perspective and not for the University of Vermont Medical Center or the Lerner College of Medicine.
So what got you into pediatric neurology?
Right. I was going to have my career as an ethologist, originally interested in animal behavior. I think Dr. Doolittle and other comic characters from my childhood got to me, like talking to the animals and how they learn. And I felt, I was looking at a lot of doomy kind of stuff as a child with, civilization, population bomb, nuclear bombs, and thought, learning, it's all about learning. And that's how we're going to save ourselves. With some illness in the family and sort of a new opening to the pre-meds who I'd always disparaged in college, felt like they were just competitive and ambitious, but I opened my mind to the idea of applying to medical school and then had some good role models and mentors in pediatric neurology, which seemed as good a place to focus on the biology and capacity of human learning as any specialty. So that's a quick account of how I got to what I'm doing, which I love to do.
And I know that we've talked very briefly that an interest of yours is the effect of sound on the nervous system, or specifically overstimulating the nervous system. Is that a main focus of your practice these days, or what? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's sort of a tangent. I mean, I'm someone who has, I think, always learned better through my ears than through my eyes. I guess we all have our particular learning aptitudes. And being a musician and classical guitar and songwriter and things like that, always interested in how do we use music and what is the soundscape like? I learned to love this notion of a soundscape as well as a landscape. And about 6 or 7 years ago, realizing that, whoa, I can't even talk to my friend on the sidewalk because of that jet going overhead. And what is that doing to us human beings? And have since learned and how to focus on both, there's the good side of the soundscape and our communication right now and how we use music and language. And then there's a downside, which has to do with this big, broad notion of noise. And there's a lot of information about that, both epidemiological and even animal models of noise as a neurotoxin.
So can you speak to the noise as a neurotoxin aspect of that?
Right. Some people might consider it a stretch, I should say. And I think it's really our awareness of detrimental effects of noise on neurodevelopment. When you look up at the NIH definitions of a neurotoxin, it includes things other than chemicals. It includes radiation. So for me, it's not too much of a stretch considering what I was referring to, biomedical literature on noise effects on the human brain, on rodents' brains, right? We always have used rodents as a predictor of what's good for us, right? Thank you, rodents, mice, rats, other animals that have been used to help make predictions about effects of substances and experiences on our own brains. So it ties into observations that started 50 years ago with a wonderful researcher, Lean Bronzaft, from New York, where I'm from. showing that intermittent train traffic outside the classroom window evidently had an effect on children's reading scores. There's a lot to say about how can you draw conclusions from these kinds of observations, but it started there, and since then there's been dozens of studies and involving thousands of people and growing awareness, which is still nascent, still just coming about, our awareness, showing that we got to really think about noise and its effect on children's brains, not to mention our circulatory system, our heart health, our mental health, pretty much as a neurotoxin and very analogous to lead poisoning 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
So what sets one sound apart from the rest of the soundscape to make it in the category of neurotoxin?
Right. Really great question, because there may be many dimensions to that. And it has to do, too, with a definition from a researcher, Daniel Fink, saying, you know what? Noise isn't just loudness, and that's measured in decibels, of course. Noise is about disagreeable sounds, sounds that are a nuisance, that are bothering us, because it doesn't necessarily have to be 100 decibels to count as noise in our experience. So, the simplest and most blunt and quantitative answer historically to your good question has been anything over 80 or 90 decibels, we know is likely to cause hearing loss. And we've long known and been aware of, if you get exposed to loud noise, and this has to do with occupational hazards in different contexts, construction and road workers, if you get exposed to over 80 or 90 decibels, you're going to have a permanent hearing loss. For example, if you get that feeling of, like your ears are a little blunted after a loud exposure, like I did after going to a Janis Joplin concert in 1970-something when I was 12 years old, sorry about that, Janis, probably hit some of those precious cochlear hair cells if you get ringing in your ears after exposure to a loud sound. This is just a way an individual could kind of say, that was toxic to my nervous system, starting at these peripheral cells called cochlear hair cells in your inner ear. So that's a quick answer to your nice question.
Okay, so it's about volume to a large degree.
It's probably it's probably about other dimensions of sound that could be in the 60 to 90 decibel range that is distracting to our attention, and probably one of the reasons why, even if those children in that classroom studied by Arlene Bronzapt in 1970-something didn't experience over 90 decibels, they still had a hit to their reading skills. So if it's messing up your attention, you're right, we need our attention to learn, then you're not going to learn so well and you're going to be set back. So that's kind of a very general statement about what is noise below that official threshold.
Now, is there something about the intermittent nature of the train versus if you're near the ocean and the ocean's having these regular crashing of waves, that people tend to at least associate that as a positive thing? Is there something in there, even if the waves are loud, there's something I find personally soothing about it most of the time?
Yeah, agreed. And that there is a nicer kind of notion and dimension of noise. For example, white noise machine. People are using those to go to sleep. So I realize that I'm kind of coming at it from like the negative point of view. And there's another definition of noise that just says something about randomness, entropy, chaos in the quality of the sound. And even there's some whole other area that says like a certain level of background noise can actually improve or functioning of our nervous system. But mind you, we're talking about low decibel levels. And so there's a complexity here. I hate to sound like I'm talking out from both sides of my mouth here, but I agree with you about your point implied in your question. Intermittent sound, and here especially talking about blasts sound, is can have an immediate and lasting effect on the nervous system, depending on the power, on the pressure, because decibels is ultimately measured as a pressure change compared to natural sounds, background sounds that are, say, noise relative to any clear signal, and that may be benign. So that's a bit of a ramble around your point, and that, there's a lot of dimensions to it. There's the intensity and the decibel count, and then there is the point of its impact on our attention when it's intermittent, right? It's more likely to pull our attention away when it's a blast or it's just any intermittent sounds. And there's research looking at this thing called our working memory, right? We're all holding an idea while we're doing something, or like you do a math problem in your head, and you hold some ideas or numbers in your head, for example. That's working memory while you're working through a problem. And there's research about, does it matter if it's a single repeated sound or if it's an alternating sound, and different theories. And that's a work in progress to look more carefully about the impact of sound on our attention.
It sounds like sound can have an effect on our attention in the moment. It can have an effect on our ability to hear in the future if we're damaging nerves. Is there long-term effects for when you're outside of the classroom that those particular noises that sound is having on neurology beyond just damaging hearing function?
Right. You could imagine that in the world of biomedical research, long-term effects are the most rarely reported. And we're left to make inferences from epidemiological studies about that. And there's a whole discussion here about if it's an observational study, it's not our gold standard for clinical evidence, which is a randomized controlled trial. We're left to say, look what's happening over there, and let's control for all these other variables and see if noise is affecting the population. And I'm taking that as evidence for long-term effects. So one area that long-term effects seem probable, and pretty strong even laboratory evidence for this, is effects on the cardiovascular system. There is a control for socioeconomics and air pollution exposure, and it looks like there's a higher rate of hospitalization for cardiovascular disease per decibel of increase when they look at something called a noise map in a population near an airport. So that, I realize that comes across as a pretty complicated idea, but it's basically saying it looks like there's some long-term effects of noise, from the best we can tell from an observational study of people living around an airport, not only on our cardiovascular system, but mental health. There are other analogous studies looking at depression, and even in Switzerland, looking at a relationship of suicide to noise exposure with, all the controls that the researchers could think of.
Has there been any research into specific sort of somebody's opinions on the sounds they're hearing? Like people have negative and positive connotations with particular sounds. Is it if there's someone who just absolutely loves airplanes and they have a bit of joy whenever they hear an airplane, which I'm guessing that joy might slowly go extinct after being exposed regularly. But if for some reason someone actually has joy from that, and it's not a stressful thing, but it's a enlivening thing, do you imagine that would have a different neurological effect than someone who's like views that as a symptom of our military industrial complex and starts getting depressed about the military whenever they hear the fighter jets go overhead?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm not aware of any evidence that could show that. It reminds me of, hey, how much something hurts us depends on the meaning we attribute to that event. And that you could say how much noise, because a certain level of noise is painful to people. And might that depend on the kind of things that you just mentioned? I think that seems likely in the short term. And yes, we hear about this discussion in and around Burlington, and whenever I can, I sort of check in with people. What do you think about the sound of that F-35 going over? And I get that, something analogous to, that's the sound of freedom. That's the sound that tells us the Russians are not going to be our government in 10 years, something like that. The idea of the meaning of it as defense of our country and our freedom. And I get that. I mean, I think that in the long term, my best sense is you're not going to get away from effects on your circulatory system. The noise is still likely driving up your blood pressure immediately. And I think that's one of the pathways to the cardiovascular effects is hypertension, regardless of the meaning that you attribute to it. And it's going to impact your attention. I don't think that question's been directly asked, but that would be my best sense.
Seems like it would be interesting to see with those, of course, political party is not necessarily a direct corollary to this, but to see if one were to control for political party or look at the difference between spots around a particular military base or like in Burlington when you're dealing with those fighter jets, but not the cardiovascular effect is different in controlling for that, which of course is very easy to say, oh, I wish there was a study that did X without, especially when you're talking about longitudinal controlled for studies.
And it brings up the issue of vulnerability and how we respect our neighbors or not in terms of, I'm making this noise, it's not bothering me. And how much do we think about other people in our neighborhood? This is a big issue, a continual discussion about neighborly relationships and the capacity for respect or not, because we know that there is some association between anxiety and maybe depression. I think that I'm less sure about depression and sensitivity to noise. There is this word called misophonia, which, and whether for genetic or other reasons, we vary widely, we human beings, in our tolerance for noise. And there, in other words, to say it more directly, there is an association between anxiety and I can't be around noise. There's my definition of noise. In other words, what's disturbing to me and messing up my quality of life may be quite different from yours. And that's just the way it is. Like, I've never heard of anybody being like trying to learn their way out of that. So variable sensitivity directly related to quality of life, whether it has to do with the long-term effects, I don't know.
So there's probably a lot of people listening to this who are thinking, well, okay, yeah, this all makes sense to me. There's loud noises that disturb my concentration, that stress me out, even if I'm not aware that they're stressing me out because I love the fighter jets, that still might be disruptive and raising my blood pressure and causing cardiovascular stuff. It all seems pretty intuitive, I would imagine, for a lot of people. Is there a piece of this picture that you feel like is either not being emphasized enough or is or that most people might not realize?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of variation in our take on what is noise as a public health issue. And from what I know, they're relatively more advanced in European countries with awareness and calculations about how many person years are taken out by noise exposure because of shortened lifespan. And we're a work in progress on this. And I've done my best to it's nice to sit and talk about it. And yet, what can we actually do about it? How can we look at ordinances in our local communities about most of what I know about Burlington, for example, is about noise at night, as though, well, we got to have latitude for more noise during the day. Well, that's still a public health issue. And there was just a city council hearing on Monday night that I attended about, can we ask our representatives, I think it's now up to the Congress people from Vermont, to have the Air Force take out the F-35 because this is affecting our health and our quality of life. And I'm grateful that the city council decided to affirm that resolution. So it's about public policy. Your question goes right to what are we going to do about it, and how can we work with our different perspectives on the meaning of this. I think it's raising awareness about noise as a neurotoxin, as a public health issue.
In your clinic, when you're doing your clinical work, how is this manifesting?
Right. It's sort of interesting. I told you that it first came to my attention when I, had just been out to lunch with a friend, and then I couldn't hear what they were saying on the sidewalk. So this has been a topic in classrooms, and there are acoustic engineers in an organization that I'm part of called Quiet Communities, based in Massachusetts, where they've done work on what's an okay decibel level. And there are different ways of measuring that. So it's been all out there in the world of trying to raise awareness with technology about something that mostly doesn't come up in the exam room where I'm interviewing kids and their families. So could check in with them about their experience of one of the leading noise issues in our neighborhood, which is the F-35. And there's discussion about, soundproofing houses, which I think is not really a solution. But there are so many other items on the agenda with our scheduled visits that I can't say that it comes up very much on the one-to-one conversations. That doesn't mean it's not relevant to their health, of course, right? Lead was overlooked as something that was having an adverse effect on children's neurodevelopment, their intelligence quotient, their attention for a long time, for many decades, while industries were doing their best to make a counter message to any evidence of lead as a public health issue. Like, no, it's okay. Look at these kids painting the wall on the Dutch boy paint can, things like that. I'm just making that comparison because I think part of the discussion and our growing awareness, and even in a hospital, there are some wonderful researchers thinking about how can we pay better attention to noise within a clinic space, within a hospital space, but it's not front and center. We're so used to, I can get used to that, like that's going to come and go next, and sort of coping with it, that I think it's a new thing to say, this is really an issue for my health, and it's good to pay attention to.
There's going to be some people who sounds, and I think that really loud sounds might not be the best example of what I'm saying, but certain sounds, like, you become so used to that they can't sleep without. I'm thinking of during the early days of COVID, I heard stories about New York City just being silent and people having so much trouble with the silence that I think the New York Public Library or I can't remember which library actually created a soundscape.
Oh, interesting.
To offer to people to play, and sort of a homage to, and it had cameras going and sirens and the turnstiles of subway. And for some people, their reports, whether or not their nervous system would agree with these reports, soothed by that, and they felt like, oh, there's my New York, and they wanted to hear that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I could imagine people wondering, what is he talking about noise when my kid wants a certain amount of noise to get to sleep, for example, as you said. And I get it. And we talked earlier about how we know there are some soothing and, as far as I can tell, non-toxic levels of noise. So one thing that it reminds me of, because I see a lot of children with insomnia who soothe themselves with digital media and all kinds of cacophony over their cell phones or their computers. We humans, we can behaviorally condition ourselves to be comforted, to meet some goals, even with stimuli that aren't good for us. That's just sort of an unfortunate aspect of neuroplasticity, of human learning. We know that we can get into habits that aren't good for us. And so I'm always, checking in about the tension that arises between parent and adolescent more often, but tween age, younger children, about containing digital phone use. This is a big discussion that's come up, especially in the last few months, about other aspects of the effects of social media and these devices on our children's development. But anyhow, I'm just mentioning that just the fact that it's comforting and they've learned to take it as a comfort and to get to sleep doesn't totally excuse it as something potentially not good for
In thinking like it might be soothing to eat food that we know is unhealthy for us, and that might
yeah,
serve a
for
psychological
example.
purpose in the moment, but that doesn't mean that it's net positive in the long run.
Right. Right. It's just more complex. Things are complex. As we talk, I sort of wanted to mention animal models of the effect of noise. And we're talking about higher decibel levels than what kids are listening to when they're falling asleep on mice and rodents and other rodents, showing that, hey, it doesn't just drive up blood pressure when you're around, 80, 90 plus decibels. And that F-35 jet has been clocked at over 110 decibels. That really hurts for a lot of people. So
110,
it,
where you're standing down on the sidewalk talking to someone, and 110
yeah,
is what you're
yeah, you're
hearing.
good to point out about the distance because we know that the intensity falls off over distance. But yes, as far as I know, that was measured, from the ground. There's also an inflammatory effect on the endothelium. So we're talking about the inside of our arteries where we want the traffic to flow smoothly. And if there's inflammation along the wall of a blood vessel, that's not good. And so there's been researchers focusing in on the effect of noise on the circulatory system that shows that noise can, in effect, cause inflammation of the endothelium in the blood vessel walls. Other research even linking it to amyloid, and partly through the pathway of hearing loss, but perhaps other pathways. There is an epidemiological association of noise exposure, say, around airports, not only with depression and cardiovascular disease, but also with dementia. And one animal model suggests that the possible pathway for that, showing that prolonged noise exposure led to increased accumulation of amyloid, this protein that's associated with dementia in the rodent's brain. Yeah,
The
it's kind of,
noisy nursing home
yeah,
and the
yeah,
hustle and bustle of all of that, and all the equipment and such, and hospital settings
yeah,
for dementia. I mean, and other, it sounds like
right.
not just that.
Yeah, your statement reminds me of I mentioned the conflict between industrial and perhaps economic interests of companies that had lead in paint and in gasoline decades ago, and that there is a very similar situation going on. There is so much economic and financial interest in technology that is producing noise that it's not a small thing to ask. And this even has come up with some of our congressmen and senators in Vermont about like, hey, that F-35 is bringing in millions of dollars to our community. Like I'm saying, like, how do you balance that with the health effects, people? Could you say that out loud? But I think what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of financial interest, even in medical centers, about like, we'd like to have that machine that's cleaning the floor going down the hospital hallway make less noise. That's going to cost money, and a lot of our other technologies. So it's a big change that we're looking to make incrementally, presumably, step by step.
How have you seen changes being negative or positive, aside from the over the past and a half?
Right. I think we could say, speaking to Arlene Bronzaft, it's like she's sort of joking around about her kids saying, you've been talking about noise for 50 years, and what's really changed that people paid attention to it? And by the way, about the F-35, one thing that changed at that city council hearing was a lot more people stood up to talk about public and personal health effects of noise. So one thing that seems to be changing, and I would like to be part of that in a way that opens discussion for different points of view, is just awareness about noise as something relevant to our health. And besides that, I think there are some state legislators interested in the possibility, expecting to meet disapproval, of setting noise limits by day and talking about what about those businesses that are dedicated to modifying mufflers so that people can have the joy for them of very noisy mufflers. When's the last time you heard an incredibly loud motorcycle or vehicle go by? This is just still at the discussion level. I can't say I can point to any other changes that I know of in the last 10 or 15 years. And when I poll my colleagues in pediatrics and neurology about, hey, do you want to speak up about this? I think they're, for the most part, clinicians, it's not on their radar too much. And I want that to change.
There's also that you, on the subject, that you particularly want to make sure people hear?
I think the question is, talking about these big wheels turning around noise and noise pollution, it still makes sense to think about how you can take care of yourself. And I do not mean to come across as a nihilist about how we can live our lives from day to day and minimize, protect ourselves from this factor of noise. So it's about being aware. It's about being aware of very loud noises. And having discussions with neighbors and asking our government to have an office, as the city of New York does have an office for processing people's concerns. It's affecting mental health. So soundproofing or I'm on the bus. I love to take the bus up from Montpelier to work in Burlington, and I'm the only one wearing hearing protection on that bus because, you hear I'm thinking about this. I think it makes sense to think about the regular exposures where you're sitting at 70 plus decibels. There's an app from the NIOSH that you can get on a cell phone that will make maybe not the most accurate, but a quick estimate of how many decibels. I was at an event in Montpelier over the weekend, and a bunch of motorcyclists went by doing something benevolent, and there was 100 decibels going right by me because I had that app on my phone. So I think it's just thinking about it and knowing when to protect your ears, thinking about greater discussion with neighbors and with local government. Can we do something about this? That's, I'm just going by my kind of both forethoughtful or planning and also day-to-day protection of our ears. Checking your hearing. No, there are patterns on audiology that tell us if and how much noise-induced hearing loss we have experienced, and it makes sense to use what are increasingly discussed kind of lower cost hearing aids that can help protect our brains if we know we have some noise-induced hearing loss. Just kind of rambling through a couple of ideas here.
I had some sound headphones at one point, and it was impressive how much that could block out. I mean, I was using those in lieu of earplugs when to some podcasts and such while weed whacking, and when the weed whacker would get particularly loud, I'd actually would hear, because there's some damage to it, I'd actually hear a little bit buzz. I think there was some sort of counter sound happening. I don't quite know how the technology works on that. The people in firing ranges, person talking next to them, but that their earbuds will filter out the gunshot happening right next to them. So that technology, not that should become a excuse for not doing public policy, as you're saying, but as that technology becomes more available, maybe we can just filter things out that are above 70 decibels and speak quieter so I can hear you might be a funny statement that we can hear in the future.
Right.
I was on a Zoom meeting with somebody who lives in an apartment building right near where the fighter jets are, and at one point he said, just a moment, there's a jet going overhead. We have to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very impressed that I didn't hear anything. that the computer had filtered out
Yeah,
100% of it, he wasn't going to be able to hear me.
right.
The technology
It's a
was there to
pretty unique.
filter that out.
Yeah, and there is discussion about classrooms or like hold it, where our classroom's going to pause its activity, just as you said. But that noise canceling technology is amazing, and I think relevant. Of course, not everybody's going to have access to it.
Does that mean we just have a bunch of the homeless people or people who have less to have access to it, or when it's damaged and someone
Yeah,
thinks that they are safe, are they damaging it more? Wonder if that
yeah,
classroom had those be some negative effect to the regular trains. Is there something? Is it just the ear affecting? Because we know noise is a vibration. Or is it only being brought to the ear, or just having a room that's shaking
right.
in our
Yeah,
nervous system to some degree?
yeah, it's definitely affecting us through our autonomic nervous system, and blasts can go right to the cells in our brain, ear or no ear. But part of what you said reminds me that, on the one hand, people tell a story about how the former President Trump was battling flights that were going over Mar-a-Lago, like, I don't know how long ago, that those flights finally stopped when he became president. And that, even people with a lot of financial resources are affected by noise. But there's also pretty clear evidence that people who are otherwise have less financial resources and have health effects from a wide variety of social determinants of health, as they are called, that have to do with lots of factors, socioeconomic and race, are apparently more often affected by noise. So that there is a disproportionate effect. And that probably is relevant to the exposures to the F-35 too, where like, okay, you can say, let's deal with it if you don't have to live under it. Not to mention, we'd like people to be attracted to moving to our communities for the resources that they bring and the work that they can do, and we're not actually making it look that good. But yeah, social determinants of health and noise exposure and health effects of that.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all these different thoughts about noise and its effect on our health, and some of the
Yeah,
legislation and possibilities as to how people are dealing with the fighter jets.
yeah. I'll welcome any follow-on questions that come from our discussion. If you hear from your audience, your listeners, I think it's always good to understand where each other is coming from. Yeah.
Anything else? Any other questions you wish I had asked, or any topics related to what we were talking about, or anything else that you wanted to share or discuss briefly?
Right. I think talked about what measures that people can take, and I think that ideally this would be part of basic education, starting in primary school and middle school. Like there's a health class, right? And our discussion reminds me to reach out to teachers who teach health class and wellness to grade school students, because we've measured hearing loss from, holding your noisy cell phone or being around loudspeakers, playing your music, the joy of that, at the same time taking a hit on your hearing permanently. And it just brings up the idea of we need, I think, to do better, not only to raise awareness in our sort of community planning, but with young people to help them to be aware of how to take care of their health and live a more healthy and better quality of life.
And one thing that I had meant to ask is, you're a pediatric neurologist, and what do you think that the sounds have greater effect on children than it does on adults? Is there any lifespan differences
Right,
in its effects, aside from the fact that hearing degrades and can either get
right.
more used to things or more damaged by things as time goes on?
Thanks. So there's always this idea that, we've done like a very high percentage of the learning that we're going to do in our first 12 years of life. And even higher in the first 3 than the than the next 9 after that. Neuroplasticity, right? It's like, thank goodness that we have these wonderful open minds as 2 and 3-year-olds and are amenable to all kinds of practices and funds of knowledge. We're ready to learn. Now, maybe we get a little more close-minded in our later decades and we're not learning as much. I mean, that's my own belief about open-mindedness in youth. So anyhow, that goes along with some vulnerability, because which way are you going to sweep those beautiful fields of synapses through experience? That's a deliberate choice. That's what parents are, feel their responsibility for. I want to do the best for my children and show them the best life that's going to lead to a happy life for the rest of their lives. And so what that adds up to is greater vulnerability in childhood in terms of any adverse effect on the nervous system, whether we chalk it up to learning or to actual destructive effects on parts of the nervous system that control our mood, our ability to regulate our attention. I didn't mention, but there's also epidemiological evidence for impact on attention. And we know attention deficit is a very widespread occurrence, different views on what should be done about it or how to define it. But impulsiveness and distractibility are a result, among other things, of noise exposure. So I'm just saying that, and my answer is yes, the growing nervous system is inherently more sensitive to adverse neurodevelopmental effects of noise.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time, and it's been fun talking with you. Getting to know more of us.
Thanks for asking me to be on. It's good to talk with you. Have a peaceful rest of Friday
as well, and have a good weekend as well.
Take care.
Take care. To Resilience Radio. Again, this is Irvin Eisenberg, and talk to Dr. Peter Bingham about sound and its effect on long-term and short-term health. Want to help out, you can always leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice. That helps out quite a bit. And next time, take care.